So when someone says they want to hire a COO, I have to be like, well, okay, what's the responsibilities? Like, what do you think that role even means? Because you really have to understand the company, understand the context. You even have to really get the business model, where it's going, and then what other things are at the table. So what is the founder's skill set or the co-founders? What other executives do you have? What are you trying to accomplish with that role? And frankly, are you an interesting enough company that you can attract a candidate who is going to make a meaningful difference?
I agree. And I think the other interesting thing that probably a lot of people don't know is both of us entered Stripe and Robinhood without that actual title.
Welcome to the General Podcast, the show where there's no host, no script, just the best builders talking about what they do and why they do it.
So, Claire, let's start with you. You left Google before I did to join Stripe, and it's a great story about how you came to make that decision because you had many choices. So, tell us how you made that leap to Stripe.
Yeah, I joined Stripe in October 2014. I've been at Google for almost 11 years. And that is nice of you to say, Gretchen. I did have some opportunities, probably starting in like 2012. A lot of people, I got on some list. I don't think the list actually exists, but it sits in the heads of many venture capitalists of potential COO candidates. And I'm sure I have Sheryl Sandberg to thank in some form for that. But I was getting calls from a lot of growth stage companies, and I got very close on a couple of them. But it just didn't end up feeling right. And then I took an introduction to Patrick Collison, who's the CEO and co-founder of Stripe, from a former Google colleague of both of ours, Brian Schreier, who was at Sequoia, who was not the investor from Sequoia, but I'm sure they were all having a conversation like, can you get this intro? And I initially said no, because I worked on some payments projects at Google and I did not enjoy it. I was like, no, no payments, no payments. But Brian, to his credit, as I would hope that's part of his job description, did not take no for an answer, and also pointed out to me that he has never wasted my time, which is true. So Schreier introduced me to Patrick. Patrick and I ended up having brunch together some Sunday. And it was good. It was really, I mean, anyone who's been exposed to Patrick Collison knows you're going to have a wide-ranging, intellectually stimulating conversation. Everything from someone they'd hired and a sort of challenging management scenario to like, what is the future? What are the things that were never realized properly in the internet? For example, payments, and what is the future of the internet? But anyway, we had a great conversation, and that was basically a 6-month process of getting to know them, me thinking about the opportunity. They were meeting other people. They were deciding, did they need a head of sales? Did they need a COO? What was the role? Very typical. Um, and I remember toward the end of that summer, so I think he and I had breakfast in like February. And then toward the end of the summer, after spending some time, I'd been driving at night after work up to San Francisco occasionally to like meet John and Patrick and start to sort of try to work together to see what kind of chemistry we had. And on the drive back, it struck me. I was like, if I don't join this company, if I don't leave Google for this one, I'm never leaving. I'm like, this is it. It had all of the characteristics, which when I boil it down, above all, great founders that I really believed in, which is really because it's kind of like making an investment. You're not investing your money, you're investing your time, which I would argue is more valuable. It's like, these are founders who I believe we don't know what's going to happen from here. I mean, Stripe was only about 80 people when I first met Patrick. But I believe in them. Two, I really saw the mission in the company as much more than payments, which it is. It's much more about economic access and infrastructure, and that matters to me. And I came to believe that the founders saw that as well. I think for them, it started with developer tools and became more that. But for me, I joined thinking this is a chance for people all over the world to have access to economic tools to hopefully bridge some divides that exist in the world. And so the mission mattered to me. The culture. As when I spent time in the company, I felt like I could see myself there and I could be a positive member of that culture, and hopefully, and I also saw an opportunity to be impactful in what they needed at the time. That I was going to learn some new things, but that I was also going to bring some experience. There was a lot of international expansion happening. Go to market needed to be built out. Organization needed to be built out, and how we run things. So it really started to come together, and I just couldn't. And the numbers looked great. I started to see the board decks, and I was like, okay, this is on the right, up into the right trajectory. But really, it was the people and believing in each other and believing we could work well together. I think these are really big decisions. Hiring your initial set of leaders for founders is, I think, really fraught. And I talked to a lot of founders, probably one, at least one a week, about like COO. Do I need one? We can go down that road later. But Gretchen, what
We
about
should. We should tackle, like, what COO actually
yeah?
means
Well,
because
what
we heard
what
things
even
in
is
every
that?
company.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But you, Gretchen, what was your story?
I was still at Google Capital or Capital G, and we actually ended up investing in Stripe after you joined. So it
Yes.
was just, you and I had worked together at Google, but then it was really fun to invest in a company that you were a part of.
I'd
And
like to think that me being part of it helped with
it was a huge
the
reason. It was
investment
our whole
thesis.
investment thesis.
I did
Yes.
have some phone calls with some capital G friends,
Yes, you did.
to, help make the case.
Yes, yes, because I believe we had passed in some earlier rounds that we should have invested in. So you talked some sense into us. So, but Claire was a big inspiration, and I had a great time. We had worked together at Google proper, and then I'd gone to help build Capital G. But when I saw what she was doing, I'm an operator at heart, and I remember calling you and asking you for advice. How did you know? How did you know Stripe was the one? And I remember you talking about Patrick and John and saying how important it is to have the chemistry with the founders, that you're bringing a different perspective, but that you really trust and believe in them, and they're ethical people that you're really going to roll up your sleeves and get into this company building with. And so when I started thinking about going back to operating role, I really took that to heart, and I had the luxury of getting to know a lot of the founders in our portfolio, and we had invested in Robinhood. So the first way I got to know them was we did a lot of help with on the security side. So we go into companies, we do pen testing, we get security engineers, and try to add value for the beginning. And I think that the founders were a bit surprised at the value we were adding, to be frank, and that it was actually useful. And so I got to know mostly Vlad that way, and ended up really spending a lot of time with him. And he had a big decision at that time. What other executives should he hire? Because he had only to that point hired, really, for the most part, undergraduate engineers from Cal and Stanford for the most part. And he said, I think I need a CFO, but I'm not sure. Do I need a CEO? I'm not sure. And so we had a lot of these great sessions. And I think he and I both got to know each other through that process, and figured out how we would help each other. And Vlad's the type of person that I learned very quickly wants to learn something from every conversation. He's just intellectually curious. He will change his mind. He loves new information, and he wants to be stimulated in that way. And so it was really fun and rewarding for me to be part of those conversations. So I joke that our CFO, Jason Warnick, owes me his job, but I convinced him, or not convinced him, but I encouraged him to hire Jason as a CFO. And as soon as that was done, Vlad came back to me and he's like, okay, great. Now you can be the COO. And
Were you
it was,
surprised?
I think a little bit, but it wasn't as simple as that. Like, I spent an hour, or maybe, no, I think it was supposed to be an hour, and I ended up spending like 3 hours with the other co-founder, Beju, and really making sure that the synergies were there as well. And it just was just so invigorating. But, my family was not on board. They were like, it doesn't make any sense to join. You already have equity in the company. You're adding a commute. You're going to get paid less. You're going to work more, right? If you make those checklists, none
Yes.
of it
There was a
made
group
any
of my
sense.
friends who were like, seems crazy to me.
Yes.
And isn't payment processing a commodity?" And I was like,
Yes.
You have to
And
be a
I think
little
you
bit of a
will.
founder yourself and be like, "Yeah, I disagree with all the advice I'm getting."
And I think you and I are very similar in that we like to build, and so it was, Robinhood was a little farther along. I think we were around 200 people, when I joined, but there was a lot to build, and so, I mean, I was weirdly excited about doing that, and I think I just missed being an operator, and I missed that part of it, and I knew in my gut that I would regret not being part of building this company.
Yeah.
So I think that's
I
like
think that
I
is a
tell
good
people that all the time.
that was like my car ride when I said, "If I don't join this one, I'm never leaving Google, and that means I'm never going back and taking all my
Yes.
lessons and doing it again." And hopefully, of course, now in retrospect, I don't think I made some of the same mistakes I saw Google make. I just made new ones.
Yes.
But still,
Exactly.
I think I knew that I had to do that at some point, help build a company.
Yes.
I think you did
Yeah,
too.
and there's always gonna be naysayers trying to talk you out of it, but you have to trust your gut
Yeah.
at some point. Um,
But there is some
um,
timing in it, like really
yes.
right stage of the company, right time. And so we said we were gonna talk about the COO job. This is the hardest one for me because I think there's not a standard job description. So when someone says they want to hire a COO, I have to be like, well, okay, what's the responsibilities? Like what do you think that role even means? And that's why I think it's also hard to use search firms, like, because you really have to understand the company, understand the context. You even have to really get the business model, where it's going, and then what other things are at the table. So, what is the founder's skill set or the co founders? What other executives do you have? What are you trying to accomplish with that role? And frankly, are you an interesting enough company that you can attract a candidate who is going to make a meaningful difference?
I agree, and I think the other interesting thing that probably a lot of people don't know is both of us entered Stripe and Robinhood without that actual title, and then it
True.
was given to us shortly after, and I tell people this story because I really appreciate it, but when, Vlad offered me the role, he said, "Okay, so you have the COO role, but we're not gonna call you that day one because there might be organ rejection within the company." And I think this goes to your point of, like, founders hiring outside executives and the inherent
Mhm.
risk that comes with this. And my guess, he never told me this, but my guess is that he was probably getting lots of advice on how these are big decisions, how do you make them? How do you minimize the risk? And he said, "Look, we're gonna" I don't even remember what the title was he called me, but he said, The scope is yours. And basically, what we're gonna do is every couple weeks, we're gonna give you another team and other organizations and at the end of 6 months, I'm just gonna change your title to COO." And to his credit, that's exactly what he did. And by that time, the people in the company were like, "Yeah, she was already doing that role. Of course, she's the COO." But I really appreciate the fact that he was thoughtful about
Yeah.
my entry and what it would mean and what teams were right to have under that scope, because I do think, a mistake some founders make is they say, "Oh, here's this big exec with a big fancy title," and people get tied, their egos get tied to the title and not the type of work, which I don't think
Mhm.
is a great setup. And I think to have that humility, but also really be thoughtful about how to set up people in an organization, I really
Yeah.
appreciated it
I
in retrospect.
I mean, he's
So
obviously also preserving option value, and all
absolutely,
founders are very, risk
which was
averse when
smart.
it comes to bringing, and they should be, because the blast
Yeah.
radius on a bad leadership hire is definitely wider. But mine was like slightly different, but there was some similar. And it's funny, I do give some similar advice to founders, but I was recruited as the COO. So it was definitely that role. And the person who had the COO title was this colleague, still a colleague of mine at Stripe, Billy Alvarado. And
Yeah.
he helped recruit me, to his great credit, by the way. This is one of the things that I think, if you think about like a powerful thing at Stripe, was very low ego initial leaders. We were all changing what we were responsible for all the time. But Billy
Yeah.
was like, I'm not a scale it up huge teams guy. He was a BD guy. He was also acting as a CFO very nicely, thank goodness. But as we start to need to really build out sales and customer operations support, international teams, I think to his credit, he's like, this is not what I do. Like, I don't. And so he helped recruit me. And then Patrick and John sort of, I think Vlad definitely had thought through it more. They were like, wait a minute, we're going to bring you in. And they were worried about organ rejection. They were worried it would look like I took Billy's job, and Billy was very well
Right.
liked, and they didn't want Billy to leave, and I said, okay. And then they said, maybe you can just be a head of biz ops. And I was like, have you looked at what I've been doing for the last 10 years? I'm not coming
Yeah,
in
that is not you.
without I'm not a title freak, but I was like, you can't recruit me for COO and then say you're the head of biz ops. So we
Right.
sort of agreed on chief of business operations, which is fine. And then, um, and we did add, just like you had the experience, we started with some teams that had been reporting to Billy that moved over to me. And then we added some more, like 1 or 2 months later. And then Patrick just sent a one-line email to the company. And he was like, hey, everybody. And I think someone on the comms team, Billy was going to speak at a conference. And the comms team was like, okay, this is really dumb because Billy's bio versus what is Claire.
Right.
They said, so Patrick's note was like, hey, everybody, Claire and Billy are basically going to swap titles, and Billy will be like the chief business officer and Claire's the COO. Goodbye. you know, that's the email. And no big deal. And it was actually no big deal. And it was probably 3 months. It was pretty fast.
Yeah.
But I think if I had come in and not been doing well, it's great option value. I don't know that you can always pull it off. I think that's where you and I are probably pretty reasonable and would understand where the founder's coming from and say, how do we meet and have a plan that we both agree on how I
Yes.
come in the
And
door
I think the humility part that you mentioned is a big piece of it, right? Like for me, the scope of work was
was
more
more
important.
important.
I was like,
Yeah.
you can call me whatever you want. I just want to make sure that, the scope is what we discussed and
Yeah.
it'll all work itself at a time. And I think that for me, recruiting other execs to Robinhood when they were really focused on title, that was actually a
Bad
huge
sign.
turnoff because they didn't have that
Yeah.
humility to be able to work at the pace and the scrappiness and all of those other attributes you
It's
need to
not just
have when you're building
humility,
a
also,
company.
it's like you're betting on yourself. Like, yeah, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna do really well and I'll get more responsibility. Like, that's my whole but some people
Right?
I think that's just the challenge. This is the other thing I say to people is if they haven't been part of building, scaling something pretty fast, and they just can't they kind of were an executive. It's not like they were born an executive, but were more big company. They're
Right.
not necessarily gonna get it. Like, they're not gonna
Yes.
get one, that they have to be more of a what I call a full stack leader, meaning do all the jobs up and down the stack, and also that the role's gonna change, and it's gonna change quickly and not in unpredictable ways, and that's part of the fun of it, but some people want, like, reassurances that are not realistic when you're a growth stage company.
Yeah. And you and I both had this you mentioned Cheryl before. We had great training ground of scaling and actually having 20 different
Oh,
jobs as we were
yeah.
doing it when we were at Google. So I think I always go back to though our joint friend Paul DeVerso would always say, "Are you good though, or were you just lucky
Yeah.
and at Google at the right time?"
Yep.
And I think it's a great question, and it was part of why selfishly I wanted to go to Robinhood to answer
Yeah.
that question, right? Like because there is a bit of luck and skill and effort all mixed
Well,
in.
certainly you're putting your own abilities on the line more when you walk in, with
Yeah.
something close to the COO title.
Yes.
Um, but
But let's talk about that because I think your job and my job, even though we were both COOs for a long time there, meant very different things. I mean, Stripe is
well, also you had a
B2B.
different background than I did. You had some experience. Actually, I would argue, despite my payments projects at Google, you had more legit financial services experience.
I had the mix of, working at Fidelity Investments before Google. So for me, my zigzaggy career, it kind of helped make sense of it actually going to a fintech. But, I think, some of my responsibilities, mine was heavy on the operational, the compliance, the regulatory, the platform work, all the non-sexy back office stuff, and then the people function,
Yeah.
and how do we scale all of those? And so for me, that balance of the Google and the Fidelity experience was really helpful because I could, I could be that bridge between we had a very technical culture, great engineers, but we also ended up hiring from more traditional financial services companies, the Fidelities, the Schwabs of the world, and those cultures are very, very different. And sort of part of our secret sauce was how do you find people that can respect and communicate with each
Yeah.
other, go back to first principles, rebuild using all of the skills and different perspectives that people bring to the table. And that was really our secret sauce on product development, creating products where we could move really fast, but were very high quality and compliant, but keep that velocity going. And we had different business lines. So how do I build out the brokerage team? How do I build out self-clearing? I had no experience in self-clearing. So self-clearing is everything that happens after the trade. And the first assignment I got when I joined Robinhood was, oh, by the way, the guy who built our self-clearing platform is leaving. You have a month. Go hire someone else. And there's only about 20 people in the whole world who have ever built a self-clearing platform. So I think I spoke to all of them. But it was more of like, how do you get up to speed on these things really quickly and then pull off running the operations, the compliance,
Mm.
all of the
Yeah.
biz ops, customer support, all of these functions that sort of weren't product and engineering and legal and finance. I sort of got all the non-sexy stuff, right?
All
Like
right.
financial crimes and dealing with our fraud
Mm-mm.
issues and all of those things. So very heavy operational, but we didn't have my scope was not sales and marketing. We didn't have a sales function. And I know that was a key
That
part of
was,
your role
yeah.
as COO.
I just feel like self-clearing sounds like some kind of wellness trend. We should all do some self-clearing. I'm glad I did not have to build that. When you were saying how you learned that he was leaving, every COO I've ever met is like, oh, within my first few days, it was apparent that half my team was basically either really didn't exist or was leaving, or I had to build. I mean,
Or I found like some people, when I asked what they did, they listed off 12
yeah,
totally different
yeah.
jobs because they were still in early stage mode and
Oh yeah.
we didn't have clear roles and
I
responsibilities.
have this I made Patrick draw the org chart for me on this piece of paper when we were meeting, and I still have it because about 1 week in, I looked at it, I was like, "This is hysterical." I'm like, this is not actually how you're organized." It's so great. It's a great artifact. So I come in and I get, um, very quickly well, our sales team was 2 inside sales reps and 1 account manager. So they were reporting to me. And then we had this biz ops team, which I'm very grateful for, which was this sort of Swiss Army knife, very smart, like any current issue that we're trying to figure out. Do we need to build the team? What's the role? How do we run the company? They were sort of my project team, and they had been helping with sales. So there were some additional resources. And then this international growth team, which pretty quickly moved over to report to me, which were essentially what became some of our first country heads. But they really I was the one who had to break it to them that they were gonna have revenue targets. I was like, "So, you're not just, like, running the market, like, you're actually responsible for the business in the market, and you're gonna learn how to be salespeople."
Isn't that funny though? I remember that moment where I was like, I think we should have goals, like data-driven goals. And and people were like, what do you mean? What what like the
Yeah.
whole idea of holding people accountable to numbers was a foreign, and I get it when you're an early stage that,
Well, you're just
you
trying to
are really
survive for a while.
you're trying to
You're just trying
survive.
to get
But
product
that
market fit. Well, what I was going to say, we sort of didn't finish the topic we were on, which is I walked in the door needing to build go to market and international expansion, take biz ops, customer support, very quickly then got the people functions, which was a couple of recruiters, period. And I think my role was sort of what I think this is a classic version of some COO role, which is inside outside, which is customer facing stuff plus all the scale up company functions that need some
yes.
scale and run the company stuff. Depending on the CFO, you might do more or less of that, but building the planning and the goals process, which is a good segue to what do you need to put in place? Gretchen, you could speak to like regulatory. We had financial crimes. Yes, we had a risk team. We had a fine, but what was happening was I was lucky enough that Billy had some financial services experience. So he was BD plus starting to scale. And frankly, our financial partners required a lot of the functions and the abilities we needed to build out. And so I did eventually have some responsibilities for risk, but that was much later on. Billy really helped scale compliance, financial crimes, risk. And then I would provide some operational help, but I wasn't responsible for that. But you cannot forget, I mean, if you're trying to, I mean, in the case of Stripe, we were like seeking to be regulated so that we could build more interesting products. And so you have this responsibility. I remember when we sort of fit out a brand new office. Well, moved many times, but in one of the more recent moves, like we had a special conference room that was for when regulators just showed up and they needed somewhere to work so they could ask you whatever
We had one of
questions and
those too.
look at whatever, it was like it was this locked conference room. Everyone thought it was mysterious. We were like, nope, just in case some regulators need a separate space in the building. But that wasn't my responsibility. I think I spent so much more of my energy building the company. I mean, I say this, like, founders have been focused so much on building the product and getting product market fit. And then all of a sudden it's kind of a different job to say, well, now I've got to build the company, meaning how do we run things? What are our dashboards? How do we do goals? And the thing I say to folks is don't do it too early. I mean, I feel very fortunate that my book has been pretty successful and people start to want to build out some of the stuff I talk about in the book. And I'm like, don't even think about it until you have product market fit. You're probably over
Yes.
40 or 50 people. Like, keep it as light as you can. And then when you do start to build it as light as you can. There shouldn't be a super extensive goals process or planning process. The key
And I
is
think
not to
people
it's like you almost
architect
yeah,
it. Yeah.
you gotta build the bones of the architecture, but if you put too much burden on a company too early, one, people resent it and the whole thing falls over and it's like not useful. But that's not the point. The point of these processes is for speed. And if you start to see
Yes.
them slow you down, then you've got something wrong.
I think that's so important, and so many people, especially when you're coming from large companies into a hyper growth company at an early stage, get that wrong, and it adds bureaucracy, and you want to do everything you can to keep bureaucracy out of the system, and you have to have that mindset all the time. But like a process is different than bureaucracy if it adds clarity, it drives speed, it a big thing for us at Robinhood was that, well, two big things, and I give this credit to our former Amazon CEO, but we didn't do slides, which I love. There was no presenting to other people.
Mhm.
It was very much a six-page doc. It's very data driven. You want to get your point across. Everyone can add comments or questions in it, and then you come to the meeting prepared. You debate. Best answer. It doesn't matter who it comes from. Gets to the top. We make decisions and we move on. But not everyone gets to be the decider, and that was another cultural moment for us where and this is part of, like, how do you build a company with the right cultural norms, which I think you and I both spent a lot of time on. But for us, I think in the early days too, everyone was just moving so fast and making decisions. At some point people had to understand their roles were different and that some people, it was their job to give input. Some people were the deciders. Some people actually got to write up the recommendations, but not everyone was the decider.
Mhm.
And it sounds simple, but when we clarified that with people, and because in Robinhood being a highly regulated industry, we had to, especially on the brokerage side, be very specific and document who was the decider on
Yeah.
key decisions. And that felt foreign to a lot of our folks who had grown up in
Never worked in
non-regulated
that.
tech
Yeah.
companies. And it was something we had to teach and really build that muscle. And it was met with some resistance, but then they saw the benefits for it. And sometimes I think, again, the idea there was speed and quality, because if you don't do those things early on, if you go to launch a product and it's not compliant, you're going to have to pull back all that work, and it slows everything down. And so for us, there was some key changes to the culture early on that let us go faster and let us deliver more for customers. But, we had to, I would say every few months sort of check in and say, all right, what do we need for this next phase of growth that's going to allow us to go at the speed that we want to go at?
And then to the point about balancing, sort of honoring that regulatory requirement with speed for the product and user adoption, were there any things that you were tricks of the tricks of how you made that balance?
I mean, this doesn't sound, it's not rocket science, but I think the golden rule is you always hire people smarter and more competent than yourself. And so the other lesson there is like, your life, no matter what job you're in, is going to come around multiple times. And so I actually went back to my compliance officer back at Fidelity that I had worked with so long ago. And I called him up and I said, "Hey, Norm, I need to hire a head of compliance. Do you know anyone?" And he said, "Let's chat. Let's chat." And, he had a huge job at Fidelity, but he was excited to be part of something where he could build it differently.
Oh,
And, he's still there and
really?
he was fantastic. And he came in and ran our compliance
That's
department. And I think
interesting
it's just
because I think it's
that's
really
one of many people that I hired that were much smarter than me and, were experts in their field.
but I think a lot of folks who come from, let's say, I mean, like a more traditional financial services background aren't successful. So, right? I mean, because the thing that I think we missed a step on sometimes was helping those folks get their head around like this is actually a technology company, not a
Yes.
financial services company. Like even fintech, I find that like a funny thing to be called. I'm like, this is really developer tools company. And so, yeah, we happen to have financial products, but the people from the industry would come in and be like, "Well, this is what you have to do." But when you actually read the regulations and you contemplate what technology can do, you're like, "Yeah, it's actually not the checklist that you had at your old job. We need
Right.
to write one that accounts for the fact that we can build the technical tools to do a lot of this. It doesn't have to be humans." Right? I mean, I'm simplifying here, but Gretchen, it sounds like Norm was able to make that transition, but we found a lot of folks couldn't.
It's a great point because I think one thing we got some hires wrong for sure, that fall in the category that you're talking about, but I think one thing we really tried to focus on in the interviewing process when we're hiring from traditional financial services company is like, why would they wanna come to Robinhood? Do they really believe that you can use technology to
Right.
automate and deliver customers a better experience? And the ones that really got it were people who were frustrated that their companies weren't moving fast enough or weren't innovating, right? And that were just sort of in the status quo state. And so they were hungry to
Mhm.
rethink the model, but they understood the model. They had relationships
Yeah.
with the regulators, right? They had these deep relationships was very important because the regulators trusted their judgment but they had a hunger to do something differently. But like Steve Quirk, who I hired to run the brokerage, was a great example. He had started at Thinkorswim, and he had that sort of startup blood in
Mhm.
his mentality, and he understood what he was getting into, and he understood how to. There's always a transition, but I think he wanted to move fast. He wanted to develop new things, but he was bringing this wealth of expertise. It was also very respected. And our different business lines had different regulators too. So our crypto business, very different than our brokerage business, very different than our cash business. So our approach was a little different for each one of those based on how stringent the regulators were and if it was federal or
Yeah.
state or so we had to have a sort of a different game plan for each.
But I
But
think one of the things, I mean, I bet you had to achieve, which I wanna go back to the point I was making about actually reading the regulations, is you have to have some common understanding that
yes.
you think is easy. It's not easy. Like, actually making sure everyone, when they read a regulatory requirement, understands what it means and is asking, and then what it means for your company, was something that again, this wasn't my main thing I focused on at Stripe, but I certainly noticed it tripping us up occasionally. And this was more in like, why are we having tension internally or a lack of decision on something in the product? And it was often a sort of go back to basics and look at the
Yeah.
regulation and have an intellectual conversation about it.
And we had those tensions too. I mean, sometimes you would have a different interpretation from legal
Yeah.
versus compliance
Yeah.
versus the product manager, right? And who gets to decide what that is and how do you what's that process? So we definitely had to work through that. But I think we got to a good place. And some tension is healthy, right? You want to debate it, but you want it to be respectful and you want it to not. Again, my worry was also we had extremely high velocity. They still do at Robinhood. And so how do we honor that but have a very robust process where we debate and turn every corner, but still move
Right.
quickly.
So you had to
That was
create
that
that
was the balance we had
culturally.
to get to.
Yeah. Did you
Yes.
and Vlad set an example? Did people see you? Because that, I mean, that tension is natural, and there's a healthy version of it and then an unhealthy version of it. But I think having people see, hey, no, we can disagree with the founders, or we can say, I think we need to try a different path. Um, sometimes is
Yeah.
important.
I mean, Vlad, his mind is amazing. I'm still in awe. He moves faster than anyone I've ever met in my entire life, and I love that about him. I mean, you know me well enough. I'm not shy about speaking up when I disagree with something. And I think we would have really good debates. And it wasn't who won. It's like what's best for our customers, what's best for
Right. You have
the
common
company
goals. Like,
and have common goals, right? It all came back to that. Like the intent was always good. And I do think there was trust. We had so much to do. There was a lot of delegation. Like I trust you to make all the decisions in this area, and we'll check in on the important ones. And so there wasn't really a lot of tension there. I think a lot of it was, we faced a lot of it with resource allocation.
same.
Always had more ideas on what to
Oh,
build
yes.
than we had capacity to do. And so the tension between what do we build for our customers, the front end
Mhm.
shiny things versus how do you allocate resources to some of those foundational things that maybe the customers don't see. But I'm very proud that the founders made the choice to invest in those areas because they wanted to build a fintech company that would last the test of time. They didn't wanna get acquired.
Yeah.
This was not sort of
Yeah.
like a quick win for them, and so they actually, um, made the allocation choices to invest in a lot of the infrastructure that, again, is not the sexy thing that anyone sees, and I think that's a big reason why they're doing so well today because now they can even move faster and build upon that.
Right. And you just, I think, have to be appropriately. There's some of that infrastructure, like for us, security. You started
Yes.
talking, security infrastructure, security investment. If you're not, especially if the founder CEO is not paranoid,
Yes.
um, that's a problem, especially if you're dealing with people's money. And so
Yes.
we're always conscious of the existential threat, and the need to be more mature and with our security posture than any other company of our stage. And I think any startup, just to translate this, is you got to ask yourself, what is the existential threat to me as a company, my business model, what I'm delivering to my customers, and am I paranoid about that from day one? Even if
Yes.
you're not mature enough to be paranoid, you
Mhm.
have to be, and I think particularly if you're in any kind of financial product area.
And you have to balance the defensive moves with the
Right,
offensive
it's
moves, right? And so I think I'd love to hear what kept you up at night over the years at Stripe. A lot of ours was, I mean, we were in a great spot that our customer base was growing, but also our transactional volume was growing. So the slope of our new customers was, up and to the right. But then on top of that, the transactional volume with crypto and brokerage and cash transactions, it was, can we scale fast enough to meet the demand? Which is I always feel guilty saying this is a great
yeah,
problem to have, but it can also be extremely stressful because we have to do everything in our power to be there for our customers. And so every decision we made, we had that customer lens on. And over the years, we had issues, we had outages, we had lots of other issues, but like, that was sort of the goalpost of how do we be there for our existing
yeah.
customers
Well,
and
that's the
continue to
other,
grow and serve them.
people always talk about new products to your resource allocation, but reliability and stability, right up
Huge.
there with security. And
Yep.
nobody gets excited to put all that work on the roadmap, but if you don't put it on, you're really not gonna get very far if you've got people's money. And so
Exactly.
being really clear about what the core pieces you have to get right are. And I think
Yeah.
for Stripe, we also believed, the customer experience. So customer support, or not having, false risk flags, which it happens. It's hard. It's hard to
Yes.
get that stuff right. We still work on it at Stripe. Um, but it sounds like you didn't have a lot of what's useful, and it's hard to suss out in the interview process between especially a COO and a CEO founder is that you have complementary skill sets and the ability to have an open dialogue, but some form of shared values.
Yes.
And I think, like, when it comes down to, like, what's the right thing to do, you can have a conversation that feels like high integrity um, and honest, right? And I think everyone's like, "Well, what questions do you ask?" I think it's, like, better to just do some scenarios. I think, like, if this thing happened,
How would you handle
how would
it?
you
Yes.
handle it? Or how would you make the decision? Or who would be involved in the decision? Would you consult me? I think that there's a danger when you're saying, "I want someone to help me run parts of the company," and then they don't get in touch with you before they make a major decision. Then they really don't
Yeah.
want someone to help them.
Yes.
And so you just gotta be really realistic about what your partnership is gonna look like.
And I think, I agree that that chemistry and that communication between the CEO and the founder or the CEO is so important. But I also think, both of us had the people function, which I feel like is this underrated function. I think especially at this phase of a business, it's a huge strategic lever. I mean, it is the engine that's bringing in the people, bringing them in or shipping them out.
Yep.
And that's what is actually building the company, right? It's more than just me, it's more than you, it's more than the founder, but do you have this shared value of an understanding of what's your talent
Yeah,
bar? How many do you bring in when? What roles and responsibilities? And even things like we had to build a leveling system. We
same,
redid our
same,
compensation strategy multiple
many
times. I mean,
times.
there are so many strategic levers in this people
Yeah.
function, that I think sometimes don't get enough credit for this company building
No.
phase,
He
which is
Right.
so
It
important.
is. People ask me what surprised me. I'm like, "Not a lot," because talked to the founders for so many months before I joined. But the thing that surprised me about the COO role, at least joining at the stage I did, was how much time I spent on compensation. Like, more than I ever would have predicted. The other thing is, like,
Hire a great person for total rewards. That is my advice.
hire multiple great people. The other thing I would say is, if I think about, like, what's the legacy, so much of the legacy, at least of my first few years, was building recruiting and putting in processes and practices that were all about keeping the talent bar, like, as high as we could. And I think including the recruiters, their talent, right? But building recruiting and building sales at the same, like, were both the high pressure things I had to get done really quickly,
Mhm.
and they're really, in a way, similarly impactful if you get them right, right?
Yeah.
Um, and and I agree that the people, the some of the people functions don't get the credit for how much they can really add to the velocity of a young company. Of course, with AI, it's going to be different, but I would argue then the people you hire are that much more important. And so if
Yeah.
you don't build how to do that well, you're going to have, different kinds of problems because you'll have more concentration of talent.
Yeah. My experience was a little different. The recruiting function was, already a well-honed
Mm.
engine when I got there. We had a lot of star recruiters. I think it was more of once we got these great people in the door, how do we actually create a high performance culture, which meant we set high bars, we had high expectations, and if you didn't meet them, we manage people out, and it was
Hmm.
it was important for the culture to move that quickly to have that high performance culture. But sometimes being the person that delivers those messages are not, you have to really create trust between that HR function and again put in all the scaffolding around it so that the employees feel supported and that they can evolve with the company. And I think that's another interesting thing is that some people who were stars in the early days of a company, some of them can evolve and
Yes.
they like to be in the hyper growth and others
No.
don't. And it's so hard to have those conversations because these people added so much value to the
Well, but you
company.
also have to keep an
And
eye
they,
on them because they're scaling, and then all of a sudden they're drowning. And if you're
yes,
not like watching the talent and you have if you don't have mechanisms to do that, you could end up with, yeah, a big problem.
right. And so that is another, I think, a really important part of that COO role is making sure you
Mhm.
have the right people at the right stage in the right
And the right
roles and that people
observability about the
and the
talent.
right observability.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
agreed.
Yes.
Agreed.
When we were at Google, one of the things that I really admired about you is I saw your leadership evolve over time. And and I learned a lot from you as you sort of listened and evolved. And one of the things I remember when we last worked together at Google was that we would be in a big complex meeting and you didn't speak up as much as you had in our earlier days, but you would come at the in the end and you had listened and processed and you would tie everything in a bow to move us forward. And I always thought like, wow, she has evolved so much from being the person who wanted to be the big voice in the room to being this amazing Zen leader. So I'm just curious, like after you left Google and you went to Stripe, how did your leadership evolve? Sort of like, what was it like when you first started how did it change halfway through? And now as an advisor, how do you think about your leadership style?
Yeah, well, that's nice of you to say. I would like to believe I can still I did that. I mean, I definitely I think we all have our awkward phase where we're figuring out our leadership style where I felt, yeah, I had to be more vocal and opinionated and also probably was micromanage like, putting a net under everyone, didn't want anyone to make a mistake, and wanted to be liked, like, I was too much in the mix, and that happens when you're sort of an individual contributor and you get promoted, you end up managing your peers, you end up like, you sort of are still part of the
Yes.
team too much and not enough, like, getting the perspective and learning and for me, my big yeah, learning how to listen better and let others figure it out, and then just I always say to folks, be a force for positive momentum in whatever the thing you're involved in. The meeting, the document, the comment, like what are we doing next? How are we getting from here to there? And for me, I also have this rule like ask a question first instead of sharing my opinion because it's just too tempting for me to get to weigh
Yes.
in. But I think I went into Stripe um, just at the beginning of moving from what I think was a pretty effective manager, like I always got the shit done. Like I had helped people, we had a plan, we got it done. But I was more of a manager than a leader. And Stripe, if you look at the big five personality assessments, which is one of the ones that research sort of says is most predictive of certain sort of default settings for people in the workplace, there's a couple of factors which the ones that come to my mind are conscientiousness and agreeableness. And I think that a lot of COO type, like really good managers, get the stuff done people are very conscientious and really quite agreeable, right? Like they get along, they collaborate well, they can sort of context switch. And a lot of founders are lower on conscientiousness because they're like, I'm going to come in and do the most important thing that I have to get done that day. And if that means blowing off the five other things, no problem. Right. And so lower, so I don't think that's a bad, there's no judgment here. That's lower on conscientiousness and often lower on agreeableness, which kind of takes the form of, I don't think this work is good enough. Or you're telling me that's going to take you 2 weeks. You're going to do it in 2 days. Or
The time.
Patrick Collis and I now have a joke where he say, you could code that in 5 minutes. I'm like, well, someone maybe could. I can't code it in 5 minutes. But anyway, and so I think for me though, I need to become more disagreeable. And Stripe was probably the moment when I went from, manager becoming leader. Thank you for saying I was getting
Mhm.
better at sort of being the Zen person in the room. But then really becoming leader is like learning how to turn up the heat. And there was this Geist was this engagement survey, and there was this question about my manager holds a high bar. And that I had really high manager scores, but that question wasn't always the highest. And it was like sometimes and I was like, really? And at Stripe, we asked that same question
Mm.
and it was really high. And I was like, yes. Like I really wanted to push and learn how to push. And I think Patrick and John taught that to me. I think I was just starting to work on it. But you kind of have to be founder like more, and I think that's what happened for me. That mix of those skills really
Mm.
became more coherent in my authentic style at Stripe, actually more than Google. And then as an advisor, and then Gretchen, I'll let you answer, like, what, how has your style evolved? It's really hard not to be an operator and not to get in the mix and like sort of say, well, exactly how is that gonna, I see you nodding, but I'm not convinced you know exactly how you're gonna pull this thing off. But I think it's more about, again, asking great questions that are informed, that feel. I got a nice compliment from a board I'm on where from one of the members, they do these like 360 surveys of us, which is it's a very good practice, including of the management team. And one of the management team members said, Claire is always poking at the thing in the presentation or in the meeting that like they're kind of worried about. So it's like being that person who still can channel being an operator and being a manager and saying something smells a little bit unfigured, like that doesn't exactly seem right. And if you can be the person who sort of pokes it, not just pokes at it, but sort of says, how can I add value? How can I help you fix that thing you're clearly worried about? Like that's very valuable. And then for me, what I love about my work working with founders now is, you can be a trusted partner who, if you can earn their trust, which I think I do pretty quickly, then you can push them on the thing that probably they're not maybe thinking about or no one internally feels comfortable saying to them. And you could say, I think the thing you're really not facing is this. And they actually appreciate it. They love it. That's what they need. They need someone who's going to be a truth teller with support, a supportive truth teller. And I really enjoy that part of being an investor or being an advisor. If we can have a kind of mutual breakthrough of, oh, the really important thing right now for me to like get better is this. That is a fun meeting to have. And it's maybe an evolution of me as a manager in a way, but more in the form of an advisor.
I think the big shift for me when joining Robinhood is I got there and I said, wow, there's a lot to get done and I can't do it all, right? This is not me going in and fixing all these problems. That is not how I'm going to be successful. That's not how the company is going to be successful. And it was a really important moment where I very quickly sort of scanned, and again, kudos to our great recruiters, but we had some really talented people already there that I felt were diamonds in the rough. And I was like, ooh, that is big talent. Nobody's realizes them. I am going to pull them under my wing and I am going to give them huge roles that they won't think that they are, equipped to handle, but I know with the right coaching they will be able to shine and really take on a ton of responsibility. And so
Mhm.
that was my way of getting things done, is that I think that was
Great.
my goal from the beginning. And I also found a ton of joy from that because, actually two of these women that I'm thinking about today that worked for me the entire time. One is the CEO of a company, one has started her own business. I mean, they're just amazing. I would go work for them today. But like there's a lot of joy of seeing people and just sort of, getting them to a point where they can get so much done and they can sort of cascade that down. And I knew that was the only way we were gonna be able to tackle all the things that needed to happen. But I like how you said you had to get comfortable with being more disagreeable. I think I went through a bit of I've never thought about it that way, but I actually think I went through a bit of that myself. I was definitely, and Vlad and Beju knew this coming in. I was definitely not a yes person to them. And I think I had different perspectives. I had different experiences. And so we would debate a lot and we'd have lots of different discussions. And sometimes the decisions were uncomfortable. And a lot of times, whether it was communicating that to teams or at our company all hands, I was sort of the voice, who got to deliver some of those messages that may not have been the most popular.
Yeah.
And I didn't mind doing that. Like, I really think I developed this tough skin of not having to be liked anymore. I fashion myself still as highly empathetic and authentic, but I really felt a responsibility to preserve the founders to be liked because they were the visionary leaders, they were driving the mission, and my role was more of, "Let's build this company, and there's gonna be some tough decisions, and I'm okay delivering it, and throw your darts at me and maybe not at
Mm,
them." And I got okay with that, which sounds like I don't think I would have been in my earlier days. Um, I tried to balance that by being very direct, being very authentic, doing what I said, being a person of my word. So I think people did trust me, and they knew that when I was delivering something, I would give them all the context and the reason why, not just, here's the decision being made. But I definitely I didn't mind being the one that sort of took the contrarian view and had to deliver it if I felt conviction it was the right thing for the company. And I think that maybe that's just more of a maturity than a leadership. But I do think that is a phase. If you want to be a leader, you have to be okay with not being liked all the time.
yeah, definitely. In fact, what I found is the more I got comfortable with that, the more people did they wanted to follow me. I was like, "Oh, this is actually," because they respect.
They
They
respect you.
respect you,
Yeah, it's a respect.
and they wanna, and also just whenever I ask people, like, "Who's the teacher that you
Mhm.
remember the most from, like, high school?"
Yes.
And it's usually the hardest teacher,
Yes.
right?
Or someone
That's
who
the
pushed
person you
you the
learn
hardest.
the most from, the one that was the hardest to impress, right? That's who
Yes.
you learn the most from.
And I would have people or teams that were scared to present to me because they knew I would hold them to a high bar. But again, in retrospect, I think they appreciated that because
Yeah,
they,
they had to bring
their
their
work
A
quality
game.
was strong. Yeah, and when they delivered, we celebrated in it too. So, I think that was a big piece. And then I think, just as we went through so many different cycles, whether it was COVID or, extreme scaling things, I think just I really tried to be available and authentic to anyone in the company that ever wanted to talk to me, and I think I hopefully, people felt that way, but I wanted to be, someone that, they could trust. I mean, people were dealing with so many hard things, whether it was work or
Yeah,
personal
yeah.
life, and so I did try to, like, balance my sort of tough decision, high bar nature with that
Supporting the people.
accessibility
Oh,
too.
of course. Anybody
Yeah, yeah,
needed either of us, I'm sure we were there
yeah.
for them.
And now not being at Robinhood, I just went for a walk with Vlad the other week. It's just you have this, you have this bond having gone
Oh, yeah.
through these shared experiences. I mean, there's so many stories that I cannot tell on this podcast that, will bond us for life. And it's, to have these people that
And you
you've
helped
built
build
this
this
company with.
company. I
Yeah.
mean,
And it's just like to see how he continues to evolve and the company continues to evolve. Like, I'm just very proud, and he knows I would do anything for this company.
same.
Anytime he
Yep.
needs my help, I am there, and it's nice to, again, I like to be useful, but it's just I feel very grateful to have had that really intense, and sometimes very stressful, but really special experience building Robinhood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I still work for Stripe, technically part-time, but part of it is so I can stay involved enough that I can help because I care deeply about
Yep.
what we've built, and I am so proud, as you said, of the people, some of whom I helped hire, some of whom I mentor, and to see them leading Stripe to levels that I never dreamed of when I joined.
And aren't you so glad you made the scary leap from Google, even all
Oh,
those
yes.
people saying it was a
Yes.
commodity?
Um,
Yeah.
that that would have been a that would have been a miss.